Just a few miles outside of town stood a very old country house. It had been converted into a daycare where parents would drop off their kids at the day, pick them up in the evening. However, said daycare had been out of business for a few years now, and there was not a sign posted in the front yard, just a few streets down the road that read, Happy Sun Daycare. There was a drawing of a cute-looking cartoon sun painted on it, and the fence in the backyard stood a playground equipment that had since fallen in disrepair and had begun to rust. A slide, a couple of swing sets, some monkey bars, and a merry-go-round were all covered by swarms of children as they played outdoors. They since become perchers for the local birds and squirrels, and they were swarmed by ants rather than children. I decided to write a report on that Happy Sun Daycare for the news block I worked for. Now, one thing, several of the citizens today had gone to that daycare. I figured that it might be a really interesting story to read about their experiences there and if it had affected them later in life in any way. The other reason it wasn't quite so innocent was that there always had been concerns of parents who would fret after leaving their child somewhere in someone else's care. That constant worry over them safe of their sons and daughters were, especially when all the horror stories posted online about various daycare-related tragedies. For my report, I decided that I would interview both the employees and the people who had gone to the daycare as children. I wanted to get as many different points of view as possible, so it wouldn't seem too terribly based. Of course, I had agreed not to use their real names for the sake of their privacy. The first person I interviewed was a middle-aged woman who looked after infants at the daycare. For the sake of her privacy, we'll just call her Margaret. What was it like working at daycare? I asked her. She replied, "Oh, it wasn't anything too spectacular, just your typical day of working with children or babies in the care." "I see," I said before I asked, "Have you had any problems while working there?" Margaret shook her head. "With babies, of course not. They could be fussy, but they weren't trouble at all. Children, on the other hand, were another story." This piqued my interest. Were the children attending of Happy Sun Daycare were too much for the employees to handle, or could it be just the cases of children going missing that have been kept a secret until now? I had to find out. "Why would that be?" I asked. "Well," Margaret paused for a moment before she spoke. She was apprehensive about speaking to me. "There were times where I heard muffled squealing. Not squealing, screaming at first. I thought it was just the children pretending to be scared, but the more I heard it, I more realized those screams were real, that something was terrifying, or possibly even hurting them." "Did you even see any children get hurt?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, most of them were just typical scrapes and bruises you expect to find on a child who fell while playing or who bumped his head while trying to show off his or her friend. Some of them, though, seemed off to me. So every so often I would see a child walk past the way to the nurse's office, and each time a child looked, he had been scratched or bitten." "Scratched or bitten? What that case would be alarm for anyone. Perhaps maybe some wild animal decided to make its home near the daycare and curious children had gotten too close. Maybe a stray dog had wandered into the playground and some poor kid wanting to pet it. Were they animals in the area?" I decided to ask. "Stray dogs, raccoons, perhaps possum nests?" I doubt it. Pets weren't allowed at the daycare, and the traps were set up to keep any wildlife away. Although there might have been a dog roaming around the area. Margaret shook her head. I point out, "Perhaps it was a dog who bit one of those kids." "Well, yeah, I only heard dogs," she told me. "I've actually never seen it. We actually occasionally hear the growl, snarl, or howl." So Margaret had only heard what sounded like a dog. It didn't rule the possibility that perhaps she had been mistaken the noise, or that she had heard of a dog. Maybe she heard some children that were only pretending to be dogs and mistook for them as one. Or maybe that she had just heard the wind and thought it was a howl. If that were the case, that would explain the scratches and bite marks that she saw on one of the children. It wasn't too realm of the possibility that one of the child could have possibly scratched his or her arm on a branch or a fence by accident. With that being surrounded like a dog's growl to her, Margaret would have reached the conclusion that children being that they were attacked by some sort of stray canine. I still had more to learn about this daycare. With the possibility of a cover-up regarding the series of dog attacks, I figured that the next person I would interview would be the former attendees. Of course, maybe one of them would have childhood memories that could possibly shed some light on that what Margaret just mentioned. After some background checking, I managed to find a young woman who went to Happy Sun Daycare when he was around 5 or 6. Let's just call him Scott. I found Scott working at a local butcher shop, and I decided to wait until his shift was over so I could start the interview. Luckily, it wasn't too long of a wait, and it gave me some time to consider what to ask them. Do you remember anything about Happy Sun Daycare? I asked. I know it was a long time ago for you, but perhaps you could recall something. Scott thought for a moment before replying, Not much. I was only maybe 5 or maybe 6 when I went. I can remember doing what kids do at that age. Play, finger paint, watch cartoons, that kind of stuff. I nodded. Were you a good kid? For the most part, he admitted. Occasionally I did get into trouble. Nothing serious though. Just your typical fussiness, not wanting to take naps, refusing to eat veggies, that sort of thing. I see, I replied, as I wrote down what he said in the notepad. And was the daycare fair that how they discipline you? Somewhat. I got a scolding for the occasional time out. Pretty much they make you sit in the corner of the room for a few minutes until you felt you were ready to join the other kids. Although you were lucky if that's all you got, Scott pointed out. What Scott said baffled me for a moment. They were lucky? How? I began to wonder if perhaps maybe there's more severe punishments that were more unruly children that attend to the daycare. Could it be some sort of controversial form of discipline that employees at Happy Sun used when they didn't want to know to the public? I had to know. What exactly do you mean? For a brief moment, Scott gave me a brief shudder, and then he seemed to recall something from his childhood that frightened him that seemed to have taken effect on his adulthood as well. The kids who got into real trouble get sent to the gray door, Scott heaved with a sigh. I've never been there myself. A few kids did. The ones who get into fights throw huge tantrums. They ended up going into that room. I don't know what happened in there, but they always come out shaking with wide eyes. A few would break down crying, some would scream, and one kid even threw up before passing out. I frowned slightly. What some sort of horrors that had been constructed in that room had been nicknamed the Grey Door. I remembered what Margaret told me and decided to check and see, and perhaps there was a connection with her story and what Scott had just said. Did the children have any scratches or bites on them? I asked. And did you even hear strange noises? He nodded. A few kids had scratches on them when they left the Grey Door, but I thought they got those before, and I just didn't notice them at first. They could have tripped or something. All I could hear was some heavy breathing. That could have been some sort of kid panting from running a lot. It's hard to say for sure. First, Margaret said that she thought she heard a dog snarling, and now Scott told me that there was some heavy breathing with the strange noises. Mysterious scratches and misbehaving children, even the mystery of the Grey Door. I couldn't help but wonder if it was that Happy Sun Daycare I've been hiding for all those years. I thanked Scott for taking the time to speak to me before moving on to the next person to interview. With my curiosity regarding the Grey Door was still heightened, I figured that maybe the person would speak to me as more of the troublemaking attendees of the daycare. I had to know more of what went on inside that room, and perhaps one of them could tell me. After doing some more background checks, I managed to track down a young woman who was referred to as Alice. She had been arrested 2 weeks ago for spraying graffiti and was charged for vandalism. But rather than spend time in jail, she agreed to do 4 months of community service, from what I've read on her records. It seemed that this wasn't the first time she got into trouble with the law. Why were you always into so much trouble? I asked her. Alice shrugged. Maybe. I wasn't sure if this was easy. It was able to get answers from her, because she seemed the type who would only cooperate if she either were to get some sort of advantage or if it means time less bars. I need to know about Happy Sun Daycare, I pointed out to her. Do you remember anything about the gray door? For a brief second, a hint flashed in her eyes, and her face became pale, with beads of sweat trickled down her forehead. That was a long time ago, Alice pointed out. I replied, surely, you must have remembered something. Records show that you were about 10 when you attended. Are you sure you can't recall anything? Alice took a deep breath and began to regain her composure. Even if it felt the mention of the gray door room was enough to put fear into her after all those years. I couldn't help but dread about the horrors that she could possibly experience. Was there someone who ran run-ins with the law? Someone who had been arrested for various crimes and primarily theft, vandalism, and trespassing? And yet there was something from her childhood that caused her fear to be pushed? Why? Okay, I'll tell you. But you gotta promise to never say anything what I told you. Got it? Alice sighed. I reassured her. I won't reveal any names, but that will be strictly confidential. You see, I was playing outside in the playground, she began to explain. I remember wanting to play on the swings, and another kid claimed that he had gotten them first dibs on them. Before I knew it, we were in a big argument and I lost control. Next thing I remember, I was on the ground crying. I must have pushed him when we were arguing, and one of the teachers came up and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me inside. She told me that I would be taken to the other kids called the gray door room as punishment. What was it like inside that room? I asked with anticipation. Alice took a deep breath and then shuddered with a sigh. The room was mostly empty. I remember the floor was nothing but dirt ground, and the only thing dingy and old light bulb was barely lit anything above. The teacher then just shoved me in, slammed the door shut, and at first I tried pounding on the door and screaming. I cried out for anyone to let me out, but it was so dark, I was so cold and scared. I heard something behind me. I turned around and I remember screaming louder than I ever screamed in my life. I frowned in concern. What did you see? It was a dog, or at least I think it was a dog. She croaked back a few tears. I didn't get a very good look at it, since it was so dark, but I remember it was the biggest and ugliest dog I've ever seen. That thing had glowing yellow eyes, huge sharp teeth, and was covered in black shaggy fur, and before I knew it, it snarled and then lunged at me as I ran as fast as I could, screaming and begging for anyone to come and save me. It grabbed onto my skirt with its teeth and tried to pull me towards it. I tripped and fell, but managed to kick it in the face a few times to manage to let it go. Then it lunged at me again, but luckily the door finally opened, and one of the teachers pulled me out of that room and slammed the door shut before that dog could get me. So there was a dog after all. Those stories were starting to come together. Margaret's story about hearing screams and growling, Scott's stories about horrific kids who'd been sent to the great door room, and now there was Alice's story about being sent to that room and being attacked was some large vicious dog. Still, I had to know more. Why did they still use a dog? And why did they cover it up? Perhaps the people working at Happy Sun Daycare were afraid that such a punishment could be too extreme to use on children. Or maybe they feared of being sued by some animal rights group. I then thanked Alice for her time and set forward to make the next person to talk to. Maybe another one of the employees if I was lucky. I was able to get one of them to reveal the truth about the gray door room. Once again, I began searching for the records of anyone who ever worked at Happy Sun Daycare. It took me some time to find someone who was willing to talk to me. Most former employees I asked were either too busy or simply just didn't want to interview. A few of them had various profanities of it as well. I couldn't tell if they were angry and I just learned what they were going on after all those years ago, or they were too afraid that what may happen if they revealed any more secrets to me. Still, I managed to track down at least one person who was willing to give me his experience at working at Happy Sun Daycare. Mr. Smith, as we call him. He worked as a janitor at the daycare back when it was still running, and he still managed to get the job, only because his aunt was in charge of one of the head offices there as well. However, Mr. Smith had moved to another town since daycare closed 2 years ago. This meant I could interview with him in person, so we sent each other an email instead. Mr. Smith explained that there was some form of tax since he was a teenager, and there was a history of sleepwalking as well. Doctors couldn't figure out what was causing his condition, but they couldn't find anything advised to health effects of it like fever. But this still made it difficult for him to find work, even though he told me he was grateful that his aunt still managed to get him a job at Happy Sun Daycare. I had asked so many questions, and as well, I wasn't sure which one to ask first. I got a response, and I wrote back of him that I wanted to know what he was able to do hold his job despite his condition. Was he on medication for it, or was the other employees and the children treat him? Now, a couple of days passed before I got any response from him, and I quickly opened the email response from Mr. Smith and began to read. He replied that his aunt would mix him as a special herbal tea for him that would keep him from his narcolepsy in check. Apparently, she had strongly believed that herbal medicine that it was better than any standard medicine on the market. Mr. Smith wrote of how tea was quite bitter and how he hated drinking it, but he had to drink it if he wanted to keep his job. Although on occasion, his aunt would run out of leaves that needed to make tea if he ended up falling asleep. His prominent other employee had to make sure that he didn't accidentally hurt himself or the others. As for the others treating him, Mr. Smith explained that in his letter that the children were generally very nice to him. Most of them were quite curious and would ask him a lot of questions while he worked. A few would generally act as a nuisance, but he didn't recall any of them being too much trouble. On the other hand, the other employees seemed to have a sense of unleashes around them, and he could explain how he felt about every seemed extremely cautious around him. So he also pointed out that his aunt would always keep an eye on him. He wasn't sure if this was due to his condition, or was some sort of a reason, thought. Now, just to ask more questions for him in mind, why were the employees uneasy around him? Was it because of the nephew of one of the higher-ups, or was it there another reason? And there was just a matter of time when his aunt kept a close eye on him, or maybe they were just trying to keep this whole issue regarding the gray door room a secret from him. Perhaps they were just afraid that he would find out about the dog and would contact the police. I had to know if anything about the room. I quickly wrote him a reply and asked him if he knew anything about the large empty room and children being attacked of some sort of large dog. After a couple of days before I got another response from Mr. Smith, I opened up the reply and began to read. He said that he didn't remember some sort of dog at daycare. In fact, he pointed out that animals weren't allowed on the daycare property, and he would set up traps to keep the squirrels and mice out. His aunts were very strict about no pets being allowed as well, most likely due to potential allergies kids might have. Mr. Smith explained that his reply that perhaps the dog that Alex claimed that attacked her was just someone in a cheap-looking dog costume. That room was barely lit, and the kids wouldn't realize that it was fake, and the scratches and bites were just the results of them tripping and accidentally scratching themselves on dirt. To my surprise, it had been that gray door room several times as well. Strangely, he pointed out that there weren't always what he seemed to have any of that tea to drink that would wake him up in the room. He wasn't sure if anyone had simply moved him there so he could sleep without being in anyone's way, or if he had been sleepwalking again and he just stumbled there by mistake. Mr. Smith explained that the room was originally going to be a large storage closet for various arts and crafts related supplies, but it was never finished due to budget cuts. He then wrote on his reply that his aunt didn't want that area to go to waste, so they decided to use it as means to punish misbehaving children. Is his opinion, someone would probably bought a dog costume and would wear it while terrorizing any young children who entered the room as a means of instilling fear of punishment for their minds. I then sent one last email to Mr. Smith, and then he said thanking me to take the time to reply to my messages. The whole thing was about the Happy Sun Daycare piece starting to come together from what I have gathered from various interviews from both students and employees, and even children who have misbehaved into a large empty space called the Gray Door Room. If that there was a dog, or possibly someone in a dog costume, that would chase any child that was set in there. It finally said that child would be pulled away to safety before the dog could cause any serious harm. Now there was only one left to do. I was going to head into the Happy Sun Daycare and investigate the infamous Gray Door Room for myself. I had to see if there was anything that could be involving this strange cover-up. Now, several minutes have passed as I drove into the countryside and towards the abandoned building. I parked my car at the driveway and took a few deep breaths. The front doors was unlocked, which was lucky for me. I gently pushed the door open and began to look inside. The interior was dingy and covered in layers of dust. Cobwebs spread all over various desks and chairs that hadn't been used for quite some time. A musty smell then filled the house, with the mix of odor of feces and urine from rats, and of how now made in their home, and it was nauseating to say the least. After I explored several different areas, I soon found a forbidden great door that led to the dreaded room. The door was quite heavy, and it took me several tries, but I managed to force it open, just like how Alice described it. The room was dark and with dirt on the floor, with a dingy light bulb. Said the light bulb had burned out long ago. It used to be an old desk proper of the door in order to see anything. I could see faint bloodstains on the ground and on the wall, but I couldn't tell who or what the blood belonged to. There was some strange markings on the wall as well. Upon taking a closer look, I could have sworn that they resembled claw marks of some sort. As I continued to examine the room, I noticed various footprints in the dirt. Many were faded or had been trampled over another, but I could still make a few out. Most of them were footprints of children. They looked like they were the children had been running away from something. They were just a distinctive set footprints that caught my attention. I examined them closely. I could definitely make out the distinctive footpads, claws, and individual toes on each one of the footprints. Now, this wasn't some sort of person in a cheap costume. Happy Sun Daycare had been using a dog to terrorize children. I had to let people know that they had been hiding for all those years. However, as I made way out of my daycare and onto my car, there was one aspect about those footprints that made me uneasy. Since when do dogs walk on two legs? And that, my little pretties, was Happy Sun Daycare, a creepypasta written by Chelsea.Adams524. My final thoughts on the story? This is actually a pretty good creepypasta. I am not gonna lie, this is actually a really well made creepypasta. Now, this, I really have to say, was a pretty well made story. I really do like how this story went out. Now, this, I think, is an old story. Not really sure if this was written maybe in 2000 and, I don't know, 2012, maybe 2013 or something. I'm not really sure when this story was made, but I'm really impressed of how this story went out. This story was actually a really well made in detail. There was definitely a lot of time and effort into it. I really do find that this story actually had a pretty good concept. Like, this actually is, the author is building up the suspense and fear with as this is a very well written pasta. I have noticed that while I was reading this. Like, this story has, pretty good for what it is. Now, to be honest, I honestly found this to be quite freaky. Like, having that room as well for, bad kids, and someone says there's like a dog attacking them. I have a theory that it's probably somebody in a dog costume, which is most likely that, but I'm not really sure if that's the case or if it's something else, but that's just my theory. I'm actually thinking that maybe it's somebody in a dog costume. That's actually a theory I do actually have. That is that's probably the reason why what happened, but I'm not really sure. I really have to say that this story actually was pretty freaky. Find out, where the kids go when they're being bad. This actually was pretty well made in detail. I really do find this story to be rather wow. It's very suspenseful when I was sitting there and reading this. This story actually, oh my goodness, this story was actually really good. I really do find this pasta to be rather enjoyable, really well made. I just really like this. This actually went a pretty good detail for what this is. Oh my goodness. This story was definitely something. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I actually heard a few narrations of this story, and I honestly have to say that this story actually was quite something. Like, this story was actually quite something for what it is. This story was actually something. I'm not gonna lie. This story was definitely something. Like, a very good good pasta for what this is. Now, I did happen to read this story, I believe, once or twice. It's still a pretty good pasta. I'm not gonna lie, it's like very good. Like the fact that the author put, time and effort into it, it's actually pretty scary for what this is. The children, the person going to interview these people, like the kids that went to daycare and then the janitor. So I really have to say that this one actually was well made in detail. I honestly really found this story to be rather fun. It's enjoyable too, not gonna lie. Like, especially with the how everything went out. Like the grammar made everything flow out beautifully, along with the sentence structuring and the paragraph structuring. So that gets a plus because I really do enjoy that the author put his or her time and effort, well, probably hers, because, it says this girl, well, the author right here. I definitely have to say that this actually was a pretty well made story. Now, I definitely have to say, I really found this story to really give me chills when I first read this story. This story is amazing. I really do find this story to be enjoyable. It was definitely well made. There's a lot of time and effort put into it. I really am curious as to the dog that is in that gray room. My theory is that it's probably somebody in a costume. I'm not really sure if that's actually the case, but it is quite something. Like, that's actually my theory. But if you guys have your own theories on that, feel free to let me know in the comments section down below. Now, with that being the case, that being said, I'm going to sit there and wrap up the review because there's not really much for me to, say anything else. I can't find anything that I don't like about this story. I don't have anything to say that I don't like about it. I really do like it. So, I guess with that being the case, so with that being said, I'm gonna wrap up the review. And like I'm gonna continue to say, and like I always continue to say, this is simply my own personal opinion. And if you happen to disagree with me, that's fine too. We're all entitled to our own opinions regards to these creepypastas, and this is simply my own personal thoughts. My final rating of this story would have to be a 10 out of 10. It was a really good creepypasta. I really do like the suspense that is in it. I do like the fear factor. I like how this went out. It actually fits out well. It was creepy. It was scary. It was well done and made. So I think this was made maybe in 2014 or something. I'm not really sure when this story was made, but I really have to say, I really found this story to be enjoyable. It's a very enjoyable story. So anyways, with that being the case, that being said, what did you guys think about this creepypasta? Did you all enjoy it? Did you not? Also, what we have done personally to help make this story a lot better? Leaving out what your thoughts are down in the comment section down below. I'm the Queen of Lions. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. And if you happen to be brand new here on this channel, be sure to like, comment, subscribe because I make brand new videos every single day. Don't forget to ring the notification bell to when I upload so then you guys will not miss an upload. And as always, please roll the outro because I'm